Hello, everybody. I think it's 2 o'clock, so we'll just start. Dear audience, guests and colleagues, welcome to the second annual lecture of Global Research Program on Inequality, GRIP. GRIP is a research program dedicated to the issues of inequality. It's based at the Department of Anthropology, and it's a collaboration between the University of Bergen and International Science Council. My name is Eline Trashchenko, and I have the pleasure and honor on behalf of the GRIP team to welcome you to this event, which is dedicated to a topic that unfortunately has become more and more prominent to the current political landscape, the rise of illiberal right. So in the 2 coming days, we have a range of distinguished scholars who will be joining us in conversations on the politics of inequality and the rise of illiberal right, a global perspective. Events that have been put together with the generous support of Rose Luxemburg Foundation. But before we set out on our tasks, I would like to give word to the Director of University of Bergen, Margaret Hagen.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to welcome you to this lecture. Dear colleagues and guests, it is I'm very much delighted to be here today and to welcome you to the annual GRIP lecture, and to welcome and introduce the distinguished scholar Walden Bello and his speech, What is Fascism, and why should we really be worried about fascists? I don't know if you are aware of this fun fact, but I am a scholar of Italian literature myself, and I have done some readings. I've done my readings in Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, etc. And I must say that I am particularly looking forward to this lecture and to the difficult answer of these questions, because among the many things and concepts that Italy has given to our society and world, fascism has also sadly turned out to be a lasting phenomenon, always finding new interpretations, versatile, also always adapting to new times, economies, new political mentalities. But I am sure that we can agree that there is a nucleus there of fascism that we are able to recognize and discuss. Inequality and poverty and the rise of the far right are among the biggest challenges of our societies today. And as academics, we have a unique opportunity to delve deeply into issues like inequality and fascism, and to gain a deeper knowledge where politicians and journalists only get to scratch on the surface. And as scholars and educators, it is our duty also to engage with complex and difficult issues and to uphold the principles of academic freedom and intellectual integrity. And I'm really proud of the research position of the University of Bergen, of course, and of the research position that University of Bergen has taken also in the issues of inequality and far-right extremism. There is a lot of interdisciplinary and impactful research taking place at UIB and at our own global research program on inequality, GRIP. Our University of Bergen, has collaborated with the International Science Council since 1992. That is, how much is it? 32 years now. A collaboration that is 2019 turned into GRIP. Inequality is indeed a global challenge, and that demands collaborations and knowledge transfers across borders and disciplines. And that is what is happening at GRIP. The symposium and lecture will look at the manifold ways in which global transformation of capitalism feed into the inequalities that have been both cause and object of the politics of far-right authoritarianism, far-wing authoritarianism. This involves thinking about the interweaving of class, ideology, and power in the context of combined and uneven relations of world history, nothing less. Some of you will continue the conversation tomorrow at the GRIP Symposium. I hope that you have an interesting symposium. I'm sure you will. And now I am looking forward to the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for those opening words and for highlighting the importance and relevance of the engagements such as this. And now I would like to give word to the person who will guide us through today's conversations, the academic director of GRIP, Don Kalb.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Margaret, for the great words that you spoke. So we have these fantastic cards where we can make notes for our speech. And Elena told me about these cards an hour ago. So I wrote my speech out on the cards and I took them with me. It turns out I took the wrong cards. So this is improvisation and I'm sorry for that. So the politics of inequality and the rise of the illiberal right, a global perspective. Let me start out with making a protest. The scandalous repression of free speech in New York and New Haven of the last days, against the background of the enormous calamity in Gaza, is unacceptable. And since this is entirely about our topic, I have to open with this, and I am sure that you all agree. I read Walden's book of 2019 about Counterrevolution, and I immediately knew that I wanted Walden to come over and give the GRIP annual lecture. Walden is not just a researcher. Walden embodies the intersection of politics, activism, research, social science, development, human rights, democracy, more than most of us, and more than most academic workers. He has been in prison. He knows what a hunger strike is. He's been a member of important political parties. He's been in parliament in the Philippines. He has received the Alternative Nobel Prize in Stockholm. And we have to do with a person who has something to say on the topic. And we're going to listen. Walden, I'm very, very happy with you being here. Please tell us, what is fascism? I gave this title to Walden. And Walden, of course, immediately said, fascism. That's what we're going to talk about. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Director Don, for inviting me to give this lecture. And of course, to all the researchers, the noted researchers and writers who will be also speaking tomorrow, as well as the faculty members who will be delivering their comments on my talk today. Well, I really am very glad to be here, not least of which I was able to give the judge in the Philippines one reason why I needed to be out of the country, which was to be participating in this event, since I'm currently undergoing trial for cyber libel in the Philippines. I wonder if you also have a law against cyber libel in this in this country. But in any case, it was it's a charge that has been placed on me by the current Vice President of the Philippines. And in a few days' time, I'll be headed back to again be part of this interesting trial. So, what is fascism and why we should really be worried about fascists? Let me begin. So my interest in fascism started when I went to Chile in 1972 to do field research during the presidency of Salvador Allende, which was cut short by a military coup on September 11, 1973. I arrived in the capital, Santiago, in the midst of the Chilean winter, greeted by tear gas and skirmishes of opposing political groups in the aftermath of a demonstration. Hauling 2 suitcases, I made it with great difficulty from the bus depot to the historic Hotel Claridge. Now, I had gone to Chile to study how the left was organizing people in the shantytowns or cayampas for the socialist revolution that the Popular Unity government had initiated. A few weeks in Santiago disabused me of the impression of a revolutionary momentum that I had gathered reading about events in Chile in left-wing publications in the United States. People on the left were constantly being mobilized for marches and rallies in the center of Santiago, and increasingly, the reason for this was to counter the demonstrations mounted by the right. My friends brought me to these events where there were an increasing number of skirmishes with right-wing thugs. I noticed a certain defensiveness among participants in these mobilizations and a reluctance to be caught alone when leaving them for fear of being harassed, or worse, by roaming bands of rightists. The revolution, it dawned on me, was on the defensive, and the right was beginning to take command of the streets. Twice, I was nearly beaten up because I made the stupid mistake of observing right-wing demonstrations with El Siglo, the Communist Party newspaper, tucked prominently under my arm. Stopped by some Christian Democratic youth partisans, I said I was a Princeton University graduate doing research on Chilean politics. They sneered and told me I was one of Allende's quote-unquote thugs imported from Cuba. I could understand if they thought I was being provocative with El Siglo, the communist paper, tucked under my arm. Thankfully, the sudden arrival of a Mexican friend saved me from a beating. And on another occasion, my fleet feet did the job. When I looked at the faces of the predominantly white right-wing crowds, many of them blonde-haired, I imagined the same enraged faces at the fascist and Nazi demonstrations that took control of the streets in Italy and Germany in the 1920s and early 30s. These were people who looked with disdain at what they called the rotos, or broken ones, that filled the left-wing demonstrations. People who were darker, many of them clearly of indigenous extraction. My experience in Chile did 2 things to me. First, it gave me an abiding academic fascination with counter-revolutionary movements. 2, it turned me into a lifelong activist with a deep loathing for the far right, and instilled a commitment to fight authoritarianism and the far right. In many ways, these contradictory drives have determined my personal, political, and academic trajectories. Fast forward to the present. When far-right personalities and movements started popping up during the last 2 decades, there was, in some quarters, hesitation, strong hesitation to use the quote unquote F word to describe them. With my experience in Chile, the Philippines, and other countries behind me, I had no such qualms. This apparently was the reason I was invited by the famous Cambridge Union for a debate on the topic, "This House believes that we are witnessing a global fascist resurgence," on April 29, 2021, where I would speak for the affirmative. Of course, a great incentive for agreeing to participate was that one of my intellectual heroes, John Maynard Keynes, had been involved in a famous Cambridge Union debate. Joining me in the debate by Zoom that evening were New York University professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Russian journalist Marcia Gessen, staff writer for the New Yorker, the prominent historian of the Second World War, Sir Richard Evans, and Isabel Hernandez and Sam Rubenstein, two Cambridge University students. In that debate, I said that a movement or person must be regarded as fascist when they fuse the following 5 features. 1, they show a disdain or hatred for democratic and progressive principles and procedures. 2, they tolerate or promote violence. 3, they have a heated mass base that supports their anti-democratic thinking and behavior. 4, they scapegoat and support the persecution of certain social groups. And 5, they are led by a charismatic individual who exhibits and normalizes all of the above. It is how they fuse these 5 features together that accounts for the uniqueness of particular fascist leaders and movements. Not surprisingly, Donald Trump figured prominently in that debate. And one of my main arguments was that what Donald Trump and the January 6, 2021 insurrection in Washington, D.C. showed was that the distinction between quote unquote far right and quote unquote fascist is academic. Or one can say that a far rightist is a fascist who has not yet seized power. For it is only once they are in power that fascists fully reveal their political propensities. That is, they display all of the 5 features mentioned above. By the way, the Cambridge audience agreed with me. The Cambridge Independent carried the news the next day that the motion was carried by 38 votes in favor, 28 against, and 2 abstentions. Thank God I didn't let Keynes down. In my work on the right, I have used the word counter-revolutionary interchangeably with the word fascist. Here, I have been greatly indebted to the great historian of counter-revolution in Europe, Arno Meyer, who distinguished between the 3 actors in what he called the counter-revolutionary coalition: reactionaries, conservatives, and counter-revolutionaries. Reactionaries, said Meyer, are, quote, daunted by change and long for a return to a world of a mythical and romanticized past, unquote. Conservatives do not make a fetish of the past, and whatever the makeup of civil and political society, their, quote, core value is the preservation of the established order, unquote. Now, counter-revolutionaries are more interesting theoretically and more dangerous politically. They may have, like the reactionaries, illusions about a past golden age, and they share the reactionaries and conservatives' appreciation, not to say celebration of order, tradition, hierarchy, authority, discipline, and loyalty. But in a world of rapid flux, where the old order has become unhinged by the emergence of new political actors, quote, counter-revolutionaries embrace mass politics to promote their objectives, appealing to the lower orders of city and countryside, inflaming and manipulating their resentments of those above them, their fear of those below them, and their estrangement from the real world about them, unquote. Counter-revolutionaries or fascists, to borrow from another great historian, Barrington Moore, seek to, quote, make reaction popular, unquote. The rise of fascism is a global phenomenon, one that cuts through the North-South divide. Narendra Modi has made the secular and diverse India of Gandhi and Nehru a thing of the past with his Hindu nationalist project, which relegates the country's large Muslim minority to second-class citizens. Currently, he is carrying out the most sustained attack on the freedom of the press since the emergency in 1976 by putting progressive journalists like Prabir Puryakasta in jail and bringing charges against noted writers like Arundhati Roy. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro lost the 2022 presidential elections to Lula da Silva by a slight margin, but his followers refused to accept the verdict, and thousands of people from the right invaded the capital, Brasilia, on January 8, 2023, in an attempt to overthrow the new government in a remarkable replication of the January 6, 2021 insurrection in Washington. In Hungary, Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party have almost completed their neutering of democracy, as we shall hear later on. Indeed, Europe is the region where fascist or radical right parties have made the most inroads. From having no radical right regimes, from having no radical right-wing regime in the 2000s, except occasionally and briefly as junior partners in unstable governing coalitions as in Austria, the region now has two in power, one in Hungary and the government of Giorgia Meloni in Italy. The far right is part of ruling coalitions in Sweden and Finland, and the region has four more parties where a party of the far right is the main opposition party, and it has seven where the far right has become a major presence both in parliament and in the streets. Pardon me if I undercounted, but the numbers keep to be changing quite rapidly. In the Philippines, I wrote 2 months into Duterte's presidency that he was, quote, a fascist original, unquote. I was criticized by many opinion makers, academics, and even progressives for using the F word. Over 7 years and 27,000 extrajudicial executions of alleged drug users later, the F word is one of the milder terms used for Duterte, with many preferring mass murderer or serial killer. Now, let me spend some time on Duterte, since he is the fascist figure I am most familiar with. Like Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, Orban, Geert Wilders, if I'm pronouncing that right, in the Netherlands, and now Javier Milei in Argentina, Duterte is a charismatic figure. Charisma, that quality in a leader that creates a special bond with his or her followers, is not just of one variety. Modi's charisma is different from that of Duterte. While Modi's charisma is more of the familiar, inspirational type, Duterte has what I call gangster charm. In this way, he connects with the masses in his discourse. Duterte has similarities to Donald Trump with his penchant for saying the outrageous and delivering it in an unorthodox fashion, precisely what drive their supporters wild. On Duterte's discourse while he was president, I would like to share 3 observations. First, from a progressive and liberal point of view, his discourse was politically incorrect, but that was its very strength. It came across as liberating to its middle class and lower class audience. Duterte was seen as telling it as it was, as deliberately mocking the dominant discourse of human rights, democratic rights, and social justice that had been ritually invoked but was increasingly regarded as a cynical cover-up for the failure of the post-Marcos liberal democratic regime to deliver on its promise of bringing about genuine democratic political and economic reform. Second, Duterte's discourse involved a unique application of what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls the strategy of condescension. His coarse discourse, delivered conversationally and with frequent shifts from Tagalog, a Filipino language, to another, Bisaya, to English, made people identify with him, eliciting laughter with his portrayal of himself as someone who bumbled along like the rest of the crowd or had the same illicit desires, at the same time that it also reminded the audience that he was someone different from them and above them, as someone with power. This was especially evident when he paused and uttered his signature, "Papatayin kita," or in Tagalog, "I will kill you," as in, if you destroy the youth of my country by giving them drugs, I will kill you. Third, Duterte's speech-making did not follow a conceptual or rhetorical logic, and this was another reason he could connect with the masses. The formal conceptual message written by speech writers was deliberately overridden by a series of long digressions where he told tales in which he was invariably at the center of things that he knew would hold the audience's attention, even when they had heard it several times. Let me confess here that when I listened to Duterte's digressions, peppered as they were with outrageous comments, like telling an audience he would pardon policemen convicted of extrajudicial executions so that they could go after the people who brought them to court, my mind had to restrain my body from joining the chorus of laughter at the sheer comic effrontery of his words. With Duterte, the digression was the message. As I said earlier, Duterte is not unique among far-right leaders in his ability to connect to his base by trampling on accepted conversational conventions and admitting to illicit desires. One of the sources of Donald Trump's appeal is that he, unlike Duterte, connects without subterfuge or euphemism with his white male basis, quote, deeply missed privilege of being able to publicly and unabashedly act on whatever savagery or even mundane racism they wish to, unquote, as Patricia Ventura and Edward Chan put it. To many aggrieved white American males, he came across as refreshingly candid in publicly calling Mexicans rapists, Muslims terrorists, colored immigrants as coming from quote unquote shithole countries instead of pristinely white Norway, and boasting that, and I quote, when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the pussy, you can do anything, unquote. So, okay, that was pretty difficult to say, but that's Trump, right? He has more outrageous comments, but I won't bother you with that. So leaders in fascist movements are critical in fascist movements, but social conditions create the opportunities for the ascent of these leaders. Here, one cannot overemphasize the role that neoliberalism and globalization have played in spawning movements of the radical right. The worsening living standards and great inequalities spawned by neoliberal policies created disillusionment among people who felt that liberal democracy had been captured by the rich and distrust in center-right and center-left parties that promoted those policies. Perhaps there is no better testimony on the role of neoliberal policies than that of former President Barack Obama, who represents the dominant neoliberal third-way wing of the Democratic Party, along with the Clintons. In a speech in Johannesburg in July 2017, Obama remarked that, quote, the politics of fear and resentment, end quote, stemmed from a process of globalization that, quote, upended the agriculture and manufacturing sectors in many countries, greatly reduced the demand for certain workers, helped weaken unions and labor's bargaining power, and made it easier for capital to avoid the tax laws and the regulations of nation states, end quote. Remember, I'm quoting Obama here, okay? He further noted that, quote, challenges to globalization first came from the left, but then came more forcefully from the right. As you started seeing populist movements that tapped the unease that was felt by many people that lived outside the urban cores, fears that economic security was slipping away, that their social status and privileges were eroding, that their cultural identities were being threatened by outsiders, somebody that didn't look like them or sound like them or pray as they did. End quote. These resentful, discontented masses are the base of fascist parties. I just wanted to emphasize that in many ways, Obama was admitting that the policies that he had shared with the Clintons and others had in fact, which promoted globalization and neoliberalism, had in fact contributed to the rise of the far right. So these resentful, discontented masses are the base of fascist parties. In France, the Socialist Party collapsed, with a significant part of its former working class adherents going to Marine Le Pen and her National Front. Their sentiments were probably best expressed by a socialist senator who said, and I quote, left-wing voters are crossing the red line because they think that salvation from their plight is embodied by Madame Le Pen. They say no to a world that seems hard, globalized, implacable. These are working class people, pensioners, office workers who say, quote, we don't want this capitalism and competition in a world where Europe is losing its leadership, unquote. Disenchanted with the Democratic Party's embrace of job-killing neoliberal policies, the white working class vote put Republican Donald Trump over the top in the traditionally Democratic swing state in the Midwest during the 2016 presidential elections. But it's not only neoliberal policies that white workers are protesting by walking out of the Democratic Party and walking into the Trump tent. As Thomas Piketty has pointed out, they also feel professional and intellectual elites have captured their old party along with Blacks and other minorities. It's not only the white working class that now forms the base of the Republican Party. Large parts of rural America have long been marked by economic depression, creating ideal ground for the politics of resentment and the incubation of far-right militias who made their intimidating presence felt in the cities where protests against police brutality spread after the killing of George Floyd. It's not only economic insecurity that helps create a mass base for fascism, but also fear or the sense of physical insecurity. Practically alone among Filipino politicians in his quest for the presidency in 2016, Duterte appealed to, quote, rampant criminality, unquote, as his main, indeed only road to power. A blistering five-fold increase in reported crime and a marked decline in effective law enforcement were recorded in the years prior to the elections, and a generalized sense of lawlessness took hold in the public consciousness, especially among the aspirational middle class, who benefited from concentrated growth in the retail, real estate, and business outsourcing sectors, but were now worried about their safety, as analyst Richard Heydarian pointed out. This conjoining of economic insecurity and physical insecurity was deadly. And with his instinct for the jugular, Duterte seasoned it, his most memorable campaign statement being his promise to cut up common criminals and drug dealers into small pieces and feed them to the fish in Manila Bay. Duterte's success in stoking crime as the path to power is a grim reminder of Hobbes' counter-thesis to Locke's on the state, that at its origins is a primordial contract between a people who are willing to hand over their rights to a sovereign who promises to protect their life and limb. Economic conditions and fear, however, cannot fully account for the emergence of fascist movements. There are other factors, social, psychological in nature, that fuel them. One is the sense felt by many white males of being adrift in a world where the traditional gender hierarchies are being shaken, the binary gender classification is being abandoned, women are gaining control over their bodies, and the traditional norm of the heteropatriarchal family is being put into question by new familiar arrangements. One of the drivers of far-right politics, especially in the white nationalist movement, is what Patricia Ventura and Edward Kahn characterize as, quote, besieged and aggrieved white manhood, unquote. Counter-revolutionary patriarchal attitudes usually come together with the most salient drives of far-right mobilization: racism, ethnocentrism, and anti-immigrant sentiment. These behavioral or ideological drives are the burning core of the fascist project, which is to create a cross-class solidarity based on skin color, religion, language, or culture by defining as the enemy or the big other those who are perceived to be different. It is not accidental that Hitler's project was called National Socialism. That is, it was quote unquote equality, but only for those of the same race and not for the other. In Europe today, the big other is no longer the big brother of the Cold War era, but non-white migrants that in dark conspiracy theories, like the Great Replacement theory, treasonous liberal elites are allying with and using to destroy one imagined community. One of the signature expressions of these theories provided by Orban, with the EU and its immigrant quota system that the far right despises in the role played by Washington's liberal elite in the United States. And I quote Orban, the situation is that there are those who want to take our country from us, not with a stroke of a pen as happened 100 years ago at Trianon. Now they want us to voluntarily hand our country over to others over a few decades. They want us to hand it over to foreigners from other continents who do not speak our language and who do not respect our culture, our laws, or our way of life. People who want to replace what is ours and with what is theirs. But just, unquote, but just to show how ethnocentrism and racism have made inroads in the European consciousness, it was no less than the foreign policy chief of the European Union, Joseph Borrell, who bared the subliminal fears driving the continent when in a speech in 2022, he pontificated that, quote, Europe is a garden, but most of the world is a jungle, and the jungle could invade the garden, unquote. In the United States, white nationalism or white supremacy is the main ideological expression of the fascist project. Racism has always been ideologically reproduced by a social structure in which racial domination has been as central as class domination. Since the late 1960s, the Republican Party, with its color-coded or dog whistle politics and program, has been the preferred vehicle of the white majority, with white non-Republicans being increasingly the outliers. White nationalism has been exacerbated in recent decades by perceived gains made by minorities, in particular the Black community, notably the election in 2008 of Barack Obama as President of the United States. Now, to the fears of Blacks gaining at the expense of whites was added the popular conspiracy theory that immigration is a plot by liberal elites in Washington to make the white majority the minority by 2042. And this set the stage for the man that CIA analyst Barbara Walter called, quote, the biggest ethnic entrepreneur of all, unquote, that is Donald Trump. According to her, and I quote, no Republican president in the past 50 years had ever pursued a more racist platform or championed white evangelical Americans at the expense of everyone else, unquote. Now, in the mind of Trump, America is an exclusively white creation. This was in full view in Trump's acceptance speech as presidential candidate at the 2020 Republican National Convention, where he said that what was unique to America was the spirit of the conquest of the land and the West by white ranchers and miners, cowboys and sheriffs, farmers and settlers, unquote. A white world made possible by the likes of Wyatt, quote, Wyatt Earp, Annie Oakley, Davy Crockett, and Buffalo Bill, unquote. Those names of television characters, based on real life characters, that Trump apparently loved as a child, reflected the nostalgia for the lost white America of the 1950s and a subliminal unwillingness to reconcile with the post-civil rights America that succeeded it. But the fear of the other, of Trump and his enriched, goes beyond nostalgia for a lost Jurassic world. According to Ivan Krestev and Stephen Holmes, white nationalism, quote, rather than being fueled by a fear that new immigrants will fail to assimilate into American culture, is fueled by a fear that they will assimilate all too successfully, unquote. Drawing on the work of Marcel Detienne, they write that, and I quote, the implication of successful assimilation is that cultural identity of natives is not a genetic historic inheritance, but instead something disturbingly superficial and relatively easy for newcomers to adopt. If those with an entirely different genetic inheritance can internalize the cultural legacy of multi-generational inhabitants of their host country, then national identity does not really reflect a blood bond tying the current generation to its dead forefathers. If true, Detienne's thesis helps explain the roiling emotionalism of anti-immigration politics. It stems on this account from an unspoken fear of identity theft. Subconsciously, we can speculate white nationalists fear that recent arrivals with biologically unrelated ancestry will expose the embarrassingly shallow roots of their cherished but fictional national identity, unquote. In India, a veritable witch's brew of resentments from a sense of Hindus being despised for being a non-martial race, to insecurities related to a demographic decline relative to Muslims, alleged demographic decline relative to Muslims, one that is said to be actively abetted by quote-unquote love jihad, has been successfully exploited by the BJP and the Sangh Parivar, led by Modi, to pursue a strategy of electoral polarization cum violence that has proved eminently successful in the drive to turn India from a secular democracy into, quote unquote, an ethnic democracy, to use the term coined by Christophe Jaffrelot. Now, whether in India, Europe, or the United States, it is this heated base motivated by a mix of economic insecurity, physical fear, resentment, or pure hatred disseminated by conspiracy theories on the internet that accounts for the fact that fascism, not liberal democracy, and certainly not socialism, that today has momentum globally. Opportunistic fascist leaders are certainly a good part of the explanation. But if Trump, Orban, Modi, Duterte, Bolsonaro did not exist, they would have to be created. Indeed, this is the reason why, although they are no longer in power, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Poland's Law and Justice Party, and of course, Donald Trump won't fade away and can be returned to power. Take the United States. The 2020 election of Joe Biden drew a sigh of relief from quarters concerned with the health of democracy in the United States. But 11 million more Americans voted for Trump in 2020 than in 2016, while 70% of the Republican Party believed, against all evidence, that he won the election. Today, Trump faces 91 felony counts across 2 state courts and 2 different federal districts, any of which could potentially produce a prison sentence. In fact, he's now on trial in Manhattan. Yet, he's left all his Republican rivals in the dust in the drive to challenge Joe Biden for the presidency in 2024. And he's leading Biden in the polls in the swing states that will determine who will win this year's elections. Again, those key Midwest states. Imitation is the greatest compliment, and Trump's competitors for the Republican presidential nomination tried to project an image of being more Trumpist to Trump. The Republican base, however, overwhelmingly prefers the original, and they are determined to bring him back to power this year, whatever the electoral results of the November 2024 elections will be. Let me just turn to a few words on the relationship between fascism and big capital. Fascism cannot be reduced to a conspiracy by big capital to repressively stabilize society and promote its interests, as traditional Marxists saw it. Fascists are not mere instruments of the capitalist class. In fact, their rhetoric is not only anti-democratic or anti-liberal, but also often anti-capitalist and anti-big business. Witness how Trump and his followers claim that they are anti-big tech or against the plutocrats, unquote. Fascists, however, do not seek to overthrow big business. They merely want an accommodation with capital to serve their movement's own interests, but with them in the driver's seat. Fascism in power, in fact, often has detrimental consequences for capital. To cite a classic case, in return for protection from a militant labor movement, German capital allowed itself to be hijacked by Hitler, and this led to its near destruction, serving as a tool of his expansionist war. During quote-unquote normal times, the far right and big capital can sometimes have different stands on some issues, as for instance, in the case today of what is called in the United States woke capitalism, for corporations piously assert that corporate policies should be pro-environment or politically correct in hiring practices when it comes to race and gender. However, these differences are transient and minor. And when capital is threatened by movements that cut into their profits or threaten their economic hegemony, it welcomes efforts by fascists to stabilize or sanitize the social order. Fascists can come to power through elections, as Hitler, Trump, and Bolsonaro did. In fact, the closer they come to power, the more some of them try to project a constitutionalist or moderate image, as Meloni did in Italy in the run-up to the 2022 parliamentary elections, and Wilders did more recently in the Netherlands. But once in power, they often seek to remain there through the use of force or violence. Violence is the main instrument by which fascists want to carry out their revolution or counter-revolution to, quote unquote, purify society, to assert or reassert the supremacy of the traditionally dominant majority defined by skin color, ethnic identity, or culture. Thus, in India, while they are reshaping the institutions of the country via their parliamentary majority, the Hindu nationalists see their power as based in the final analysis on their capacity for violence, which they periodically unleash to remind subordinate communities like the Muslims of their quote unquote inferior status, unquote, as they did in the Gujarat massacre of 2002, which was masterminded by Modi. As for the United States, Moira Donegan of The Guardian reminds us, and let me quote, "America is no stranger to political violence, but usually it comes from the right. Mass shootings are routinely carried out in public in America by men with far-right political agendas who massacre church worshippers, grocery shoppers, or high school students in the service of a cause. The death toll from these explicitly political atrocities has been assimilated into our social fabric, hardly registered as assaults made on behalf of a movement. Meanwhile, far-right militias from the polo-wearing Proud Boys to the masked and khaki Patriotic Front hold parades meant to intimidate their political enemies and the populations they consider undesirable. Sometimes they threaten or beat people. Sometimes they surround state capitals with guns on display. Once they stormed the Capitol. Right-wing political violence is likely to shape the 2024 election. And barring the emergence of a dramatically different political settlement, it will be a feature of American life for the foreseeable future, unquote. Blatant espousal of violence is now common, even among elected members of the Republican Party. For instance, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a leading member of the far right in Congress, has told the Republican base that, quote, "The only way you get your freedoms back is if it's earned with the price of blood," unquote. And I don't think he was referring to Thomas Jefferson's phrase about the blood of patriots. I think the association between fascism and violence would not be a surprise in this country, where the neo-Nazi Anders Behring Breivik killed 77 people, most of them teenagers, in shootings and a bombing attack in Norway's worst peacetime atrocity back in July 2011. Let me end by switching from the analytical to the normative, from being the academic to being the activist. First, how do we counter fascism? First, we need to stop resorting to easy explanations about the rise of the far right, like the claim that trolls are responsible for it, and acknowledge that far right personalities and movements have a critical mass of popular support. Second, we must acknowledge that in being able to mobilize people using the most up-to-date methods available on the internet, the fascists are far ahead of us. To cite just one example, in 2020, Modi, who was among the top 5 most followed world leaders on the social media, had 45.9 million followers compared to opposition leader Rahul Gandhi's 3.5 million on Facebook. Tremendous gap. Next, we need to find ways of stopping the extreme right from coming to power in the first place, like building broad united electoral fronts. Even with non-fascist groups we may have differences with, it's much harder to remove the far right once they're in power. Even if they lose elections after they're in power, their work in reshaping democratic institutions may be very difficult to undo. As New York Times commentator Michelle Goldberg notes, with respect to the transition in Poland from the law and justice regime that lost the October 2023 elections to the new liberal government led by Donald Tusk, and I quote, "The new coalition government has a mandate to rehabilitate government institutions, but the former rulers aren't ceding control willingly, and often there's no consensus about who has the authority to settle conflicts related to the transition. For Poland's new leadership, roadblocks to reform are everywhere." Unquote. Fourth, we need to make sure we have at the leading edge of our resistance those movements which have a great deal of resonance among broad sectors of the population, including the middle classes, such as the movement to stop climate justice, promote gender equality and reproductive rights, and advance racial justice. Again, the example of Poland provides some encouragement this time. As Goldberg points out, playing the key role in the electoral outcome of the October 2023 elections was, quote, "public revulsion towards a far-reaching abortion ban," unquote. Likewise, in the United States, the result of the US presidential elections this year may well hinge on the resistance of women to the threat posed by the far right to control over their bodies. Fifth, we must fiercely defend human rights and democratic values, even where, or especially where, they have become unpopular. This will involve aggressively championing people and groups that are currently persecuted, with majority opinion being whipped up against them, like Muslims in India and non-white immigrants in both the United States and Europe. International solidarity with the persecuted, it is an essential element of the anti-fascist project. Compromise here will only encourage the fascists. Moreover, equality, human rights, democratic rights, and due process are the cornerstone of the democratic worldview. When it comes to freedom of movement, of course, every country has the right to manage migration in an orderly manner. But this is very different from virtually sealing off its borders for racist, chauvinist, or religious reasons that are disguised as, quote, protecting our values, or preventing disorder, or saving jobs, quote unquote. Sixth, let us not fear to see what we can learn from the extreme right, especially when it comes to the politics of passion or the politics of charisma, and see how our values can be advanced or promoted in passionate and charismatic ways. We must unite reason to passion and not see them as being in contradiction. Though, of course, we must not violate our commitment to truth, justice, and fair play in the process. Seventh, if history, especially of the United States, is an indication, one must not preclude the possibility of violent civil war. And should that become a real threat, to take the appropriate steps to counter it. Before I left the US a few days ago, I was able to watch the movie Civil War, which apparently is a big hit in the box office. But you know, this fear of civil war, it was essentially the movie was trying to capture this, and it's a fairly gory movie, though it lacks a bit of context. But I'm sure that it'll be coming to Norway. The CIA analyst Barbara Walter is not crying wolf when she writes, and I quote, "Where is the United States today? We are a factionalized anocracy, a degenerating democracy that is quickly approaching the open insurgency stage, which means we're closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe." January 6th was a major announcement by at least some groups, such as the Oath Keepers, that they are moving towards outright violence. In fact, the attack on the Capitol could very well be the first series of organized attacks in an open insurgency stage. It targeted infrastructure, there were plans to assassinate certain politicians and attempts to coordinate activity, unquote. Given her background, it is not surprising that Walter suggests that part of the response might involve, quote, engaging in targeted retaliation where government should arrest, prosecute, and seize the assets of insurgents, unquote, and pursuing, quote, a strategy of so-called leadership decapitation, which involves imprisoning the leaders of a terrorist group to hasten its collapse, unquote. But this raises the question of how far partisans of democracy should cooperate with the institutions of the state and still preserve their commitment to protecting basic freedoms and due process. Anti-fascists must protect democratic freedoms, but ensure that actions to protect those freedoms do not turn into state-directed repression, which is certainly going to be a really big challenge in trying to walk that line. But probably most important, we need to have a transformative vision that can compete with that of the far right, one based on genuine equality and genuine democratic empowerment that goes beyond the now discredited liberal democracy. Some call this vision socialism, others would prefer another term, but important thing is its message of radical real equality beyond class, gender, and race. Our gamble is that the side of human beings that values cooperation and yes, love will triumph over that side that seeks a regression to Nietzsche's blonde beasts. Rosa Luxemburg, the German Marxist, the martyr German Marxist, wrote that the future belonged either to socialism or barbarism. In the 20th century, barbarism was stopped in its tracks. Will that also be the case in the 21st century? Let me end by saying that there is no guarantee. There is no guarantee that fascism will not triumph. But it will certainly win unless we put ourselves, body and soul, fully but smartly on the line to stop it. Thank you very much.
Walden, thank you very much.
Yep.
We have lined up two formidable commentators from our community in Bergen. Siri Gloppen, founding director, Center for Law and Social Transformation, and our pro-dean, my colleague, Geir Presterudstuen. Do I pronounce it rightly? That's a difficult word. Walden, they take about 5-7 minutes, 2 times. You will have a short chance to reply, and then there's a floor open for discussion. Siri?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a really formidable lecture where you sort of paint a picture that we recognize. It's easily recognizable, it's well argued, and it makes us, of course, understand why we should be scared, very scared. I will focus on a couple of points. I will not sort of argue with your main story at all, because I think I agree with your story. I want to, in terms of sort of making clear that to sort of show us the contours and the nature of the danger that is very real, and some very, very important aspects of that. So one of the points that I want to, one of the question, of course, that you raise is, you say this is fascism, and you say it like you could argue with that in a way. I mean, you're arguing this against someone who would say this is right wing, but it's not fascism, right? So I guess that one of the one of the points that maybe you would then get as an opposing view is that these modern fascists, if you want, that they have a different economic basis. There is a different sort of, it's not the strict regimentation of social and economic forces that is often seen as a characteristic of fascist movements, as in Italy, the fascist Italy, or Germany, where you had corporatist structures, for instance, that would then be an alternative to the liberal democratic structures for democratic processes around the economy. And this is something that is not an element of your definition, but it's also not generally not an element of what we see today. So in some way, you could say that the right wing of fascist leaders that you talk about, they respond to the same type of concerns. They read the worries and concerns and problems that are in the great, sort of in large parts of the masses, and they read them in a way, desperation in the masses that this is not something that the current system will respond to in an adequate way. But they don't sort of have the same type of structural or economic solution to that problem. In fact, their solutions vary a lot. It's very, very different, or non-solution in a way. It's very different with the relationship to economy that Donald Trump has from what, to some extent, what Bolsonaro has, certainly what Modi has, and also what the Eastern European leaders have. I mean, the sort of relationship to the welfare state, to the relationship or welfare provisions of different kinds, the relationship to the regulation of economy is really, really different. And you could argue that some try, like maybe Modi, has more of an, for instance, and also Eastern Europe to some extent, has more an attempt, it's more a policy that to some extent attempts to respond to economic ills as well. So I think this is something that I just would like to have your views on. So that's my first point. And my second point is there is a sort of ambiguous relationship to law. Because a lot of the current literature on sort of democratic backsliding, which focuses a lot on, of course, on these same cases, would sort of focus on both the use of law, autocratic legalism, the use of law to erode legal and democratic institutions and structures by changing sometimes by changing them formally, sometimes by eroding the norms that underpin them. For instance, as one very classic example is the appointment of judges in the Supreme Court judges in the US, where all the norms where the Republican Party in the way they just disregarded the long-term norms, thus changing the court in a very radical way. So, but in many ways, sort of appointing different types of people to institutions so that they would totally change and so on. So this would be one way that they use the law to change the way the system operates. The second would be to use rights and law in this way as a way to mobilize against democracy. It was rights for the wrong people that you were talking about as well, but that you have this ambivalent relationship to the law, using the criminal law against opponents, sort of using corruption charges, using the law in very many ways against the law. So I'd like you to comment a little bit on this, because this to me seems to be something new, to some extent, or at least more widespread. And also, you point to, in a way, the use of law as a solution to some extent, in the sense of the use of rights as a solution, as parts of opposing fascism or opposing the ultra right. But at the same time, I'd like to we see that courts are becoming extremely important sites of opposition around the world. At the same time, this in a way is also in some way circumscribing the struggle in a way that is interesting to discuss. Are we then sort of embracing also problematic sides, the judicialization of politics, if you want, and in a way that maybe prevents radical solutions? This is just a deep concern of mine, but it's something that I want to put. And then one last, if I can, one last point, which in some ways refers to the first. Like there is I mean, it's not only that they have a real following; they have a real diagnosis of a problem. I mean, there is a real problem out there that the alt-right is responding to. I mean, people are deeply, deeply worried. And of course, you end up saying we need better solutions. We need a better solution. We need a better answer to how to have a transformative shift. But so my worry is that in a way the conditions for political the conditions for political mobilization to some extent are good. I mean, it's easy to mobilize. That's why, I mean, some are better, but we could be better at mobilizing. We could be better at sort of mobilizing in social media and so on. But the problem is to get from mobilization to a form of organization that can develop solutions. Because that is where I think the challenges are in a super quickly shifting political landscape where you don't need parties anymore, really. You can just, Trump doesn't really need the Republican Party, they need him, but he doesn't really need them because he can sort of discuss directly. If they make policies that he doesn't like, he just doesn't do the policies. So how do we both get good at mobilizing through social media, but how do we also develop the capacity to actually develop good alternatives? Okay.
Thank you, Siri. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm sitting on my foot. Yeah, thanks for the invitation to be here, and thanks for a very inspiring. I thought I was very happy that you allowed us to meet both the academic and the activist version of yourself, and because I think that creates an equal part erudite and inspiring lecture, which I think is necessary to answer these questions. I wanted to sort of start on that somewhat difficult intersection there as well between thought and action. And my initial reaction to this was also that I was interested in what sort of creature fascism is in your narrative here, because I think that is ultimately the important question here if we want to fight it, and how we can begin to understand it. And the way I read your talk, it's a spoiler, I managed to read it before he gave it here, was in some way that fascism, as you describe it today, emerges more like a political process, almost like rather than a clear-cut uniform political ideology. So almost like a sort of empty vessel that can be filled with different forms of resentments and social organization and cultural baggage, and then directed towards at least slightly different ideological causes. You say in present-day United States, white nationalism is its main ideological expression, while in modest India and Duterte's Philippines, it comes to very different forms. I recognize, of course, that this is a description of the object, which probably is more attractive to an anthropologist than a political theorist, right? But I do think there is a very interesting potential there that we can, or a potential insight there. Not only that it serves to focus our attention on the specifics, local specifics, and the social and cultural context on which where these diverse fascist movements emerge, but also perhaps more importantly how it focuses our attention or our gaze, if you want, on the everyday people, those who both produce these mass movements and ultimately become subjects of fascism, right? I think that is an extraordinarily interesting point to start if you want to understand this. And I thought immediately about, if you look at the re-emergence of French far-right politics, for instance, is quite informative here. If you look at the electoral map of France, certainly northern France or classic sort of working class or peasant areas of France, and compare the early 1990s to compare it now, I think you will find that the sort of areas that had a very strong communist vote in the early, late 80s, 90s, now same areas are very strongly Marine Le Pen. And if you ask these people, with some people, I haven't, but I've less read people like Didier Eribon, right, who would say that what people say is a little bit what Siri alluded to here. They say that, well, they talk about real issues, they talk about jobs, and they offer solutions, right? So that's an obvious case in point here, I think. But even a more starker case is the Duterte, and I was very happy about how you gave this used very much of your own local understanding. But Duterte, in a very sort of mundane sense, also shows this extreme willingness to articulate problems, right, and offer simple narratives to solve them. But he manages to do so in a very spectacular fashion. And I think that your points here about the spectacle is quite informative. Of course, spectacles are, by their very definition, quite revealing, right? There's always something. They're there to show something. And you say, and I think this is almost a quote at least, that Duterte was seen as telling it as it was, as deliberately mocking dominant discourse of human rights, democratic rights, and social justice, and so forth, that has in the Philippines been ritually invoked by people who have no intention or no willingness or certainly no ability to do anything seriously about it, right? And I think that that narrative is true in a number of contexts. Then I think, you know, an important point here is, you know, how the establishment's insistence on these things like human rights and social justice or whatever has been revealed as deeply hypocritical, right? Most of these people who talk wildly about that are bombing people to smithereens elsewhere while they're saying it, right? To use Obama as an example there. So I think that's important. It's a really good point and a good way into understanding this. But I also, at the same time, this sort of insistence, we have the left, whatever that is, those on the left, have also let this insistence on human rights and social justice become sort of synonymous with weakness in a way that people like Duterte manages to capitalize on, I think. And the fascist power of action and violence is constructed in direct opposition to that, right? You know, these limp politicians. And in the process, the politics of kindness in a way, or kindism, snillism in Norwegian, has become a sort of a word that people in the center left or whatever is very scared about themselves. It's become so derogatory that, you know, you have politicians in the Labour Party trying to mimic the sort of fascist tough talk about needing to stop being kind and so forth. I wonder, to me, that is quite a fatal mistake in sort of taking substance when we should have mimicked form. So we mimic substance instead of mimicking form. Just anecdotally support that. I lived and worked and researched in Australia for almost 20 years and followed that country's, what can only be described, I think, that country is quite steady but slow march towards fascist politics, both as a researcher and teacher and everything. The last person who managed to reverse some of that process and who was seen as very effective against it was a Labour leader called Paul Keating. And his talent were dual, I think. One of them was that he was seen as saying things what it was, and a total uncompromising defense of social justice and speaking loudly about it. But he combined that with a form which was extraordinary, sort of brutal oratory strategy, very much sort of the carnivalesque tough talk. That included, of course, calling Tory leaders for fascists and fascist enablers and things like that, but also very sort of carnivalesque name calling that cut through a lot of the bullshit. He famously said the opposition leader had a brain like a swallow's nest, all shit and sticks, which is a wonderful sort of evocative term, I think. And my question then, I think, what can we do? Or is it that we're missing something of this unashamed leftist populism, if you want, to combat fascism, that learns something about the form of these fascist leaders, but uncompromisingly retain a social justice substance. And I thought about this particularly since you revealed yourself to be a fellow John Maynard Keynes fan. And for many years I had a Keynes quote, and it, words ought to be a little wild, for they are the assault of thoughts on the unthinking. And I think this wildness of words and oratory skills is something worth supporting. I had one more point. Can I make that as well? Yeah. And that had to be about your slight critique and on the sort of classic leftist understanding of fascism. You know, Terry Eagleton says fascism emerges when it has to, you know, when big capital is on its knees and all of that narrative. The urgency of, you know, working a bit more sophisticated with the underlying dynamics, and that is not lost on me. And I don't think we should let contemporary fascists off the hook that easily to sort of blame the other people. But on the same token, I wonder though, if we have to be careful about letting the establishment so easily off the hook, because there's something behind this, or at least letting it happen in a number of places. I mean, the causal relationship between Trump and the big capital is obvious, but I'm also thinking about what's happening in Europe, places like Germany and the UK at present, for instance. On one level, it's quite instructive to look at the extraordinary gymnastics undertaken by establishment politicians in those contexts to defend the Zionist fascists' extermination of Palestinians, for instance, and also enabling it quite actively in many cases. That certainly speaks to an acceptance of extreme violence and also a willingness to mobilize the state apparatus to stifle democratic opposition against it, which is interesting. And at the same time, of course, at least in the UK, which I think is an interesting and scary place to study at the moment, they build political platforms almost entirely on scapegoating and persecution of a defined other, right? First it was Eastern European migrant workers, now it is refugees. And most alarming of all is perhaps that the most violent expression of that particular policy, this sort of Rwanda offshore plan, is in line to be implemented not by the openly right-wing Tories, but by the likely successors, the Starmer's Labour government. And that indicates certainly, you know, that there's a whole establishment here that are fueling or enabling a lot of this fascism. Also that, and has constructed a populace that is reliant upon it. The only thing lacking in the UK case, of course, is a charismatic leader. I don't think certainly not Starmer can be accused of having an answer charisma. So, but I wonder therein lies a critical point here. Terry Eagleton, of course, you said earlier that if we didn't have Trump and if we didn't have Duterte and them, we'd have to create them. I wonder, that's scary enough, but they are somehow predictable opponents in a way, recognizable as fascists. But I wonder then if it's not a different challenge altogether then, when we see the political center that has shifted so dramatically to the extreme right, that its so-called respectable core are the ones responsible for implementing and pushing fascist policies forward. And one question then to the activist in you, how do we mobilize against that enemy? And yeah, that'll do me, thanks.
Well, brilliant. There's some stuff on the table. Walden, do you want to reply 3 minutes, 4 minutes? Yeah?
Well, thank you very much for the comments that were, I think, very important and insightful and challenging. Let me just respond to them. And I'm sure that my response will probably raise more questions, because usually these things never get answered definitively. First, on the issues that you raised, let me start with your concern that in response to the lawlessness or lack of adherence to the law of certain far-right or right-wing personalities, that also creates the problem whereby in a liberal democratic system, the final solution becomes decentered from parliament or the executive into the courts. That, as you called it, the judiciarization, or, as others might have put it, democracy becomes a litigious process. I certainly would say that that is especially, say, in the United States at this point in time, when we're talking about the #1 presidential candidate of the Republican Party being charged with 91 felony accounts and facing trial after trial before the elections, that indeed some people have argued that this is in fact going to create even more appeal for Trump, the one who's being judicially persecuted, and that for his adherents, this will be a very good point by which they would say that democracy has been subverted by the judicial process itself. And I know progressives who in fact have said that this is the wrong way to go in terms of dealing with Trump. You have to leave that up to the electoral process. And if the electoral process in fact decides that he is the one, then they say that all of these judicial protections are going to crumble once the people have voted. So I just wanted to say that, first of all. The second point related to that is, of course, the way that the institutions of the establishment get converted into instruments of radical right-wing or fascist politics is different from one case to another. In India, for instance, this is my understanding, is that the court system itself is under assault from Modi, and that it is mainly a combination of the executive power and the parliamentary near supermajority that the transformation is taking place at this point. And then if you see that as, and the third point is how the formal institutions of the state can in fact be subverted and used, to advance the same political objective. And they become very pliable once you have a very charismatic and popular leader in power. Then the formalities of separation of power begin to just crumble. my understanding on the question of the state and violence, coercion, and the law, my understanding of what's been happening in Hungary has been in precisely, and in a number of other European countries, I guess the law and justice regime in Poland was precisely the use of parliament to enact laws, that would basically erode democracy. And, that, again, if my understanding is correct, that outright violence has, or even violence or even popular mobilizations on the street have not been so much the method of turning the institutions, the regime, the political system into a more radical right or fascist one, but the very clever and strategic use of the law in a number of these countries. So this is just in response to a number of the points that I think very well taken points that you raised. In terms of aside from stoking resentments and the process of fascistization, in terms of what do they really offer in terms of the restructuring of the political system, or what would be a post-liberal democratic system. And again, here I think there's, I think we need to have some flexibility in terms of understanding fascism, because in many ways, even between Mussolini and Hitler, where Mussolini had the classic corporatist structure, as opposed to Germany, which was extremely fluid, with the Nazi Party eventually just being the key thing that transformed everything. So I guess once these parties do come to power, I think there's a great deal of contingency and the possibilities that they would use to reshape the political system that would be very different in one case from another. Certainly, some probably don't have it as well thought out as the others. Trump and his group is beginning to do that. They already have something of the beginning of how they would transform the system once they get back to power in 2025. And I'm not that familiar with the plan, but it certainly is very scary to a number of people that I've talked to. And of course, again, my understanding of India is that the BJP, the Sangh Parivar have a more well thought out plan for transformation. So I would say that post-liberal democratic politics, there's a great deal of difference among this. And a lot of it also is groping for what would be the best solution, and not really having a blueprint or a very well articulated blueprint from the start, but very confident or very central about your objectives, which in the case of India, for instance, is that this is going to be a Hindu state rather than this secular state. So those are just some comments that I would like to bring out with respect to the points that you raised, which again, I think are, very, very insightful. Okay, now going to the issues that you raised, which I also felt was, were very challenging. I never really got to hear cheating, but I do think that at least before, Australian politicians have a much rawer edge to them than politicians in Europe. Okay, and the quote from Keating that you said is just something that could only have come in Australian context. But yes, I guess what you're saying is, how does the left, or how do progressives articulate a vision in a language that appeals to people without looking wimpy, or as the Americans call it? So how do you get about this, around this politics of kindness that has become too identified with liberal democratic parties? And that's precisely what I think is a challenge at this point. How does one articulate visions of justice and equality that departs from the traditional ways that it has been articulated and get reviled as bleeding heart liberalism? And so this was it's a challenge in the Philippines. We faced this challenge in the last elections, that basically you articulate human rights, you articulate social justice, but the language in which it is articulated is immediately called yellow language, because yellow was the color associated with liberalism and liberal democracy in the Philippines. So there are, this key phrases, that for the mass base of people like Duterte and Marcos would immediately turn them off. You haven't even gotten to your key message, they've already been turned off by the language. So that is, I don't see any solution to that. I'm not exactly sure that the kind of masculine rawness of Keating, and aggressiveness of the Keating type is the solution to that. But it is a challenge about how we articulate our goals in a way, that really does not fall into immediate classification of us as bleeding heart liberals. And again, also, how do we get around the traditional language of rights? Because when we articulate rights at this point in time, it usually is in the language of negative rights, the way Isaiah Berlin put it, between negative rights, which is the defense of the individual, as opposed to positive rights, which is rights that develop a community and the individual. I think part of the problem in right now is oftentimes one gets cornered into defense of due process, defense of negative rights. And how does one then articulate, this image or these divisions of positive rights, especially when we're talking about equality and justice in a period when, in the popular mind, socialism has failed, and even its social democratic alternative has also failed. So, so it's, as you said, it's both a question of substance and it's a question of language. So, and those two things really come together. So again, this is really quite a very important challenge. And then I believe, let me just see here. I think there was one last point that, okay, the last point you made. I guess I was reacting to the easy tendency oftentimes of people, progressives, to just equate fascism and capitalism, and the idea that, you know, it still comes out now that it is the fascism is the rule, is a terroristic rule of the most reactionary sections of the bourgeoisie, which was the Dimitrov. I believe that the Dimitrov definition, and how instead of looking at the intricate and complex interactions between fascism and monopoly capital, that whole sort of thing is elided for a simple, you know, oh, this is really big capital trying to, you know, defend its prerogatives, and you know, it has not been able to do that through the liberal parliament democratic process, and so it resorts to fascist foot soldiers. And I think that that tendency, that automatic tendency, which is still, I think, exists in many parts of the left, you know, it just ignores the complexity of this relationship. And again, the question of Germany. Yes, I think the German monopoly capitalist class had a central role in allowing Hitler to come to power, primarily in order to be able to stabilize the system and to discipline labor, but at the cost of them losing their own autonomy. I mean, Hitler dragged them into a war that nearly destroyed them. And just the possibilities after that war, you know, for German capital that was faced by German capital was that at the end of that war, I think they realized that, you know, they were facing the Morgenthau plan, which was the plan that would completely deindustrialize Germany, of eliminating the bourgeoisie and just turning it into a pastoral economy. I mean, that's of course I guess my point here is that this instrumentalism between big capital and fascism continues to. I don't think it's dominant, but you still hear it. And part of what I said here was precisely to try to deal with that. You see this because the conflicts often the conflicts are sometimes, of course, rhetorical, like woke capitalism, and a lot of the Republicans have been coming down on Disney, on you know, Silicon Valley, and saying that, you know, this kind of woke capitalism in which you have to pay respects to gender equality and affirmative action. You've seen a lot of that in the political campaigns in the United States leading up to the 2024. But my sense here was, of, you know, that if worse comes to worse, inevitably, and the system fails, capitalism will have a strong tendency to favor the forces that will stabilize the system. But that relationship will be a complex one. So again, I would just like to say thanks. The points were very well taken. It was two very interesting and very important interventions that both of you did, and it was my privilege to be able to deal with them. Thank you.
Well, these were a fascinating 3 or 4 minutes. Thank you very much, Walden. It was very rich, and it was, you know, big pleasure to think with you along. And so it's. But the floor is open, and I can imagine that we have a whole bunch of quite smart people here. I see a couple of them, and I can also imagine that they want to say something. Shall I give you the microphone? Do you want to come? Why don't you come here? Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. Bjørsvik from the International Committee of the Green Party, Norway. Thank you. A couple of comments and then 2 questions. The democratic world is awakening as the problem is increasing. And also to the top level, I mean, Joe Biden has invited to this summary for democracy, which I am personally skeptical again towards because of the inviting autocratic leaders and the Western leadership in general with Israel, Gaza now is doubtful, to say the least. We as Green Parties also formed a global network with the Global Greens with the intention of having alliances, which I believe in, with the academia, the media, civil society, and so on. But questions. You mentioned the women's movement pro-abortion. What other examples do you see of shining? Because we need some, I guess, some hope, clarity, inspiration. Do you see occurring now around the world, which we could kind of support? And the second one is from Norway. What could we possibly do more of, also from academia, political and civil society, to support without being seen as interfering in national politics?
Thank you. I think I'm going to line up a couple of questions. Mark, can I ask you here, or do you want to have the microphone there? Better there? Yeah, good.
Thank you, Mark Edelman from New York. There's a phrase that jumped out at me in Walden's lecture I think is hugely important. I hope we can unpack a little bit more in our work over the course of this seminar, and that's gangster charm. And you used it mainly to refer to Duterte, but it fits very well, certainly Trump, Modi, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, etc. And you connected it to this tendency to sneer at opponents, to go off on these digressions. And I've come to think, watching Trump in my own country, that the digressions are hugely important because the man is incapable of forming a complete sentence. He's incapable of reading off of a teleprompter. I think there's a certain amount of evidence that he has seriously a reading disability. But in any case, when he digresses and speaks extemporaneously, people say he speaks like us and he's speaking to me. He doesn't have any filters, and this is very attractive, and people feel represented. They feel that they have a voice, when most of the time they don't feel that way. And the gangster charm thing is interesting because, you know, many of these figures have it, but they're surrogates. The people are just, they call them surrogates in the US political campaign world, the people just below the level of the candidate who are in effect spokespeople have more permission to do this. So if you watch Trump's sons, Don Jr. and Eric, they're even more violent and confrontational. They routinely urge people at rallies to beat the crap out of any protesters that might happen to have showed up, and that happens. And this is becoming institutionalized in laws that make it essentially almost legal to drive your car into a crowd of protesters and things like this. So there's an intimidation element that is important and begins to pervade the whole system. One of the problems in the United States now is that in many regions, it's impossible to recruit people just to administer elections because they know that they will be targets of intimidation. So this violence has a way of ramifying out in a very troubling way. He talks to me thing. I read something very interesting a few days ago that Modi in his current campaign, in his previous campaign, they deployed holograms of Modi, of the candidate, in different Indian villages to kind of mystify people and make him seem omnipresent. Now they're deploying artificial intelligence so that people get a phone call of somebody with a voice like Modi, but saying their name, like, Don, hello, this is Narendra Modi. So this is speaking to me in a very direct way, using that digitalized thing. I guess my question, having gone on for too long, Walden, you say that you envision the possibility of civil war in the United States, and certainly you're not the only one who has raised that. My sense is it will be more a situation of generalized violence and massacre because they have the guns and we don't. I'm living in an area now, a rural area, where, I'm probably the only person for miles that doesn't own a firearm. And the voting records are actually public. Like when I moved to that place and registered with the Democratic Party, because in New York State, a lot of elections are determined in the primary, the party primary, I immediately got a postcard from the one other Democratic couple on our road because they saw in the records. So somebody else could go into those records with a more nefarious purpose and have their way with us. So I don't see a civil war. I just see a lot of horrible bloodshed and massacres. And I wonder what you're thinking about that.
There was one more question immediately behind you, Mark. Can you pass? I don't know your name, sorry. But yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
Philip. I hope you allow me for just a brief context because there were so many great points made. And I guess I wanted to start with something that Geir said about the establishment. I'm currently reading the book by Yanis Varoufakis, Adults in the Room. And there he talks about not a conspiracy theory of the people that are planning at the top everything that's going on, but more of a box that no one really knows how it works and no one knows they're in it. So at the time he describes, so in the book he describes the Troika moment where Greece was bankrupt. And he says that both, for example, Angela Merkel, Schäuble in the German central bank, and all the other people in the institutions kind of did their part sort of alone. They didn't know they were the part of a bigger, I guess, play, but all of it together became this sort of monster that no one really knew how it worked. But of course, he realized that the establishment of the two center parties, so the center right and the PASOK, who call themselves socialists, like many European parties do, played a big role in enabling this at the time. And I guess my main questions, I have a lot of points here, but is the far right and the fascist movements in their great majority here in the West have grown from within the center right. So in the US, from the Republican Party, if we can call them center right at all, but in Portugal with Chega, in Spain, Vox, Germany with the AfD, etc. Although not in the case of Italy, where Meloni came from the fascist movements as a young woman. But my question is, how hasn't the traditional conservative and neoliberal right realized that they are doing something wrong? They are self-destructing and destroying everyone around them. They aren't changing course, though, it seems. They aren't able to, at least the good intent, like the well-intentioned people within the democratic right, aren't capable of fixing course and realizing, okay, we're doing something wrong here, it's not working, it's generating all of this, all of these unintended but maybe predictable consequences. What do we do to change so we actually become a part of the democratic play without generating all of these unintended movements?
Yeah,
Thank you.
excellent. Thank you very much. Oh, Christy, and then Ewald, and then when the word goes back to you again, one more time, Walden, okay? I'm sure that we have to close it down after this. Christy, please.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. I also enjoyed the responses. My name is Christy van der Westhuizen and I'm from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. One thing that I wanted you to perhaps elaborate more on is just the role of corruption. And because it seems to me that, you know, we're living in an era where through neoliberal capitalism, we've had massive deregulation, we've had liberalization, et cetera, but just been written about a shadow economy arising across the world, perhaps multiple shadow economies, criminal economies, et cetera. And you see a kind of a new class of transnationally linked politicians and business people and so on and so on. Many of them members of the super wealthy and so on, but interlinked with organized crime at a global from a global level to a local level, and then associated regimes like Russia and so forth. So that this is, because I'm wondering about ultimately what's the politics. These leaders are responding to a very real need on the ground, which was caused by the socioeconomic devastation of neoliberalism. But what's driving these leaders? Ultimately, it's not about solving, I think, as has been said, of solving actually the very real problems faced by populations. It's more actually about, I think, an agenda of elite accumulation, of claiming impunity, and also for their own predatory behavior, also at an individual level, and then collectively as this class. And so part of it's also about creating disorder and conflict and so forth and so on. So I would love to hear more about your impressions on that, perhaps also with reference to the Philippines specifically. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ewald Engelen, University of Amsterdam. Thank you very much for the very inspiring lecture on the verge of academic analysis on the one hand and public political activism on the other. I've got two short questions. You put a lot of emphasis in your lecture on the agency of fascist leaders to attract voters. But what about, and this basically builds forth upon comments made by Geir, what about the failings of the technocratic establishment, which have pushed those very same voters to an alternative story, which at least gives them sensible diagnosis without providing them, but they will soon find out, providing them with the answers to those problems. So what about the failings of mainstream technocracy? And isn't fascism basically the child of the failings of technocracy, which is shared by both the center-left and the center-right? And I would include the Greens. And secondly, halfway through your lecture, you shifted to the more activist genre, so to say, and you ended your lecture with a call for vision. But the word preceding that call for vision was we. We need to provide voters with a vision. Who is the we? Who is the implied audience of your lecture? As if the progressive left is homogeneous. No, it is not. So who is the implied audience of your lecture?
Well, brilliant. You know, these are a couple of issues that we have about 2 minutes to discuss. Walden, can I give you the word for about, 120 seconds? Yeah?
Well, all these questions were, as the previous questions were, extremely important and raised issues, that really need to be addressed in a more extended context. On Ewald's point, the first point, definitely I agree that the whole solution that was offered by the center-left and center-right was part of the problem. And the policies they, in fact, pushed were part of the problem. And in fact, I would say, that Obama's political economy, which was to continue the industrialization of the United States, was fatal. And one of the things that Trump did when the first day first or second day in power was to basically say that he was ripping apart the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which so many of the labor movement in the US had identified as, this is why the Democratic Party is not going anywhere. The implied audience, the implied we was basically, I would say, the left, as however one sees the diversity in the left. But I would say that basically people who do care about real democratic empowerment and real social justice being delivered. And I do feel that the majority of people, in fact, do believe that the politics of cooperation they're much more open to that than the politics of hatred that comes with the right. So it's a fairly broad audience that I think I'm talking about, although I should have made that clear during the talk itself. Yeah. The issue that was raised about how does the establishment or center right deal with it, I think that's for them to answer at this point in time. But the way that the Republicans have dealt with it is definitely a horror story from that point of view, because the Republicans virtually just surrendered the Democratic Party to Trump. And all of those Republicans who said that they were not really Trumpists, you can count them on one hand at this point in time, because so many of them, after the 2016 elections and now, have really gone over to, to the Trump base. The issue, the Varoufakis, and my sense is what you were saying is that the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Economic Commission were not really coordinating, but I think what they had together was the ideology of neoliberalism, and that's why, they were arriving at the same conclusions. There was hardly no debate, right? No debate as to how to deal with Greece. You just had to impose austerity. There was even no question on that. So that's I believe that exhausts the issues that were raised. And I'm sorry if we need more time really to tease things out. Thank you. That was 20 seconds, right?
Walden, thank you very much. It was wonderful.